Why hundreds of women fought for one night with the Sultan. Ayşe pressed her face against the latticed window and watched him walk through the garden below. The Sultan. Every woman in the palace wanted him. Hundreds of them, locked behind these walls, waiting for a single glance, a single night, a single chance to become something more than a forgotten girl in a golden prison. She watched the way he moved, slow and deliberate, like a man who had never been told no in his entire life. The other women crowded behind her, pushing to see, their breath hot on her neck, their fingers gripping the window frame until their knuckles turned white. Someone whispered his name like a prayer. Someone else made a small, desperate sound in her throat. Ayşe felt her own heart beating faster, felt the shameful heat rising in her cheeks, and hated herself for it. She had been here 3 weeks, and already she was becoming like them. Already she was learning to want the one thing she could never have. The first time she saw the golden cage, she thought it was a palace made for angels. Marble columns rose toward painted ceilings, where golden stars seemed to float in an eternal sky. Fountains whispered in courtyards filled with roses and jasmine. Light poured through latticed windows, casting geometric shadows on floors so polished she could see her own reflection. Women moved through these spaces like silk ghosts, their slippers silent on stone, their voices low and careful. Everything was beautiful. Everything was soft. Everything was a lie. She had arrived in chains, not metal chains. Those had been removed at the outer gates, but she felt their weight anyway, invisible around her wrists and ankles and throat. The journey from the slave market had taken 2 days. She had been placed in a covered cart with 5 other girls, none of them speaking the same language, all of them crying in different words that meant the same thing. The cart had rattled through streets she couldn't see, past sounds she couldn't identify, until finally it stopped, and the doors opened, and she saw the walls of Topkapi Palace rising above her, like a mountain made by human hands. The eunuchs had been waiting, tall men with smooth faces and voices that didn't match their bodies, high and strange. They had looked at the girls the way merchants looked at grain, checking for quality, for defects, for value. One of them had grabbed Ayşe's chin and turned her face toward the light, examining her skin, her eyes, her teeth. She had stood there trembling while he prodded and evaluated, while he decided if she was worth keeping or worth sending back. Finally, he had nodded and released her, and she was pushed forward through gates that closed behind her with a sound like the end of the world. Inside, the palace swallowed her whole. Corridors led to more corridors. Courtyards opened onto hidden gardens. Staircases spiraled up and down to places she couldn't imagine. The harem occupied an entire section of the palace, a city within a city, separated from the men's quarters by walls and locked doors and eunuch guards who watched everything with eyes that never blinked. They took her to the baths first, stripping away her filthy travel clothes, scrubbing her skin with rough cloths and soap that smelled of almonds until she was pink and raw. The older women who worked the baths spoke to each other in Turkish while they worked, ignoring her questions, laughing at something she couldn't understand. When they were done, they dressed her in a simple cotton shift and led her through more corridors to a large room filled with narrow beds. This was where she would sleep, with 40 other girls, maybe 50, all of them new like her, all of them bought and brought here to wait. The beds were so close together, you could hear the girl next to you breathing at night. You could hear her crying. You could hear everything. A dark-eyed woman sitting on the bed nearest to hers had looked up when Ayşe entered. She was perhaps 20, older than Ayşe by a few years, with the kind of beauty that made you uncomfortable to look at directly. Her name was Hürrem, and she had been in the harem for 6 months already. She spoke enough broken phrases in enough different languages that most girls could understand at least some of what she said. She smiled at Ayşe, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had learned not to trust anyone. They gave you a new name here, Hürrem explained. Your old name died when you passed through the gates. Ayşe meant she who lives. It was a common name for slaves. It meant nothing. Hürrem's real name had been something else. Something from a place she wouldn't talk about. But that didn't matter anymore. Nothing from before mattered. There was only here and now, and the endless waiting. Waiting for what? Ayşe had asked. Hürrem had laughed. Waiting for him, she said. Waiting to be chosen. Waiting to be noticed. That's what everyone here was doing. The entire harem, hundreds and hundreds of women, all waiting for the Sultan to look at them. Ayşe learned the rules quickly, because you had to. Wake before dawn. Wash. Pray if you wanted to. The Sultan appreciated piety, even if nobody believed you were sincere. Eat a small breakfast of bread and honey and yogurt. Then the day stretched out empty and endless. Some women embroidered. Some learned to play instruments. The oud or the ney. Thin, haunting music that drifted through the corridors. Some studied Turkish or Arabic or Persian, trying to improve themselves, trying to become the kind of woman a sultan might want. Some just sat in the gardens and stared at nothing, their eyes already dead. The hierarchy was everywhere, invisible but absolute. At the top was the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, the true power in the harem. She was a small woman with iron eyes and hands covered in rings that clicked together when she moved. She had been a concubine herself once, brought here as a slave just like Ayşe. But she had done what most women couldn't. She had given the old sultan a son who survived to adulthood and took the throne. That made her untouchable. That made her a queen in everything but name. Below her were the sultan's favourites, the women who had spent nights in his bed and lived to tell about it. Some of them had borne him children. Sons were worth everything. Daughters were worth something. A woman who gave the sultan a son became Haseki, elevated above all the other concubines, given her own apartments and servants and a stipend of gold. A woman who gave him multiple sons became almost as powerful as the Valide Sultan herself. Then there were the Gözde, women who had been noticed but not yet elevated. They lived in better rooms, ate better food, wore better clothes. They had been touched by possibility, and it showed in the way they moved, the way other women looked at them with naked envy. And then there were the Kariye, the serving women, hundreds of them, girls like Ayşe, who had been purchased and renamed and placed in this golden prison to wait. Most of them would wait forever. Most of them would grow old in these rooms, their beauty fading year by year, their hope dying so slowly they didn't notice until it was gone. They would become servants to the younger girls, then servants to the favourites, then invisible altogether. Some would be married off to palace officials, a mercy or an insult, depending on how you looked at it. Some would simply disappear, sent away to provincial palaces, or retired to small houses in the city where they lived on tiny pensions and memories of the years they spent waiting for a man who never looked at them. But some, a very few, would be chosen. That's what kept them all going. That tiny, impossible chance. The selection nights happened irregularly, sometimes once a month, sometimes not for half a year. The Valide Sultan decided when. She would choose 40 or 50 girls from the hundreds available. Girls she thought might please her son, and those girls would be bathed and dressed and presented like offerings to a god. Hurrem had been chosen twice already. Both times the Sultan had looked at her and looked away. She never talked about it, but Ayşe could see something dying in her eyes each time, some small light going out. The days blurred together. Ayşe learned Turkish slowly, painfully, one word at a time. She learned to embroider, although her stitches were clumsy and uneven. She learned the names of the other girls in her dormitory, learned which ones were kind, and which ones would steal your food if you weren't watching. She learned to navigate the endless corridors of the harem, learned which gardens were open to girls like her, and which were reserved for the favorites. She learned to recognize the different eunuchs, learned which ones were merely indifferent, and which ones were cruel. She learned that the beautiful palace was also a prison, that the golden cage had bars, even if you couldn't see them. At night, she lay in her narrow bed and listened to the other girls crying. Some cried quietly, trying to muffle the sound in their pillows. Some sobbed openly, past caring who heard. Ayşe had cried herself empty in the first week. Now she just lay there in the darkness, feeling the weight of all those other bodies around her. All those other girls who had been taken from their homes and brought here to wait for a man who didn't know they existed. Sometimes she thought about her village. It was a tiny place in the mountains near the Black Sea. So small it didn't have a name, just a collection of wooden houses clustered around a stone church. Her father had been a farmer. Her mother had kept goats. She had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. They were poor, but they had enough. They had been happy, or at least she remembered it as happiness now that it was gone. The slavers had come in the spring. Not Ottoman slavers. These were Tatars from the north, raiders who swept down from the steppes, looking for anything valuable they could take. They had burned 2 houses and killed her oldest brother when he tried to fight. They had taken Ayşe and 4 other girls from the village, roped them together like animals, and driven them south. Her mother had screamed. Her father had stood there with blood running down his face from where they had hit him, too dazed to move. Ayşe had looked back until she couldn't see the village anymore, until there was nothing behind her but smoke. The Tatars had sold them to Turkish merchants in a coastal town. The merchants had separated them, evaluated them, decided who was worth taking to the capital. Ayşe had been worth taking. The others she never saw again. She didn't know if they were alive or dead, if they had been sold to brothels or farms or private homes. She would never know. The merchants had taken her to Istanbul, to the great slave market, near the docks, where human beings were bought and sold like cloth or spices. She had stood on a platform while men examined her, while they discussed her value in words she didn't understand. The palace eunuchs had been there, shopping for the harem, and they had purchased her along with 5 other girls. The price had been high. She was young, 15 or maybe 16. She wasn't sure anymore. She was pale-skinned and honey-eyed and untouched. that made her valuable. That made her perfect for the Sultan's harem. Now here she was, lying in the darkness, listening to girls cry in languages she was learning to understand. Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Georgian, Circassian. The harem collected women from everywhere, from every corner of the empire and beyond. Some had been tribute, gifts from governors and generals hoping to curry favor. Some had been purchased like Ayşe. Some had been born here, daughters of concubines who had no other place to go. They were all prisoners, together, all competing for the same impossible prize. The girl in the bed next to Ayşe was named Safiye. She was Georgian, bought the same day as Ayşe, but from a different merchant. She was beautiful in a way that made other girls hate her. Tall and pale, with hair so black it looked blue in certain light. She never cried. She lay in her bed every night with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, perfectly still. Ayşe thought maybe she was broken inside, that something had happened to her that had turned off all her feelings. Or maybe she was just smarter than the rest of them. Maybe she'd figured out that feeling anything in this place was a mistake. During the day, the girls were supposed to improve themselves. They attended lessons in Turkish and Arabic, in music and poetry, in the arts of pleasing a man. Old women taught them how to move, how to speak, how to lower their eyes at the right moment. They learned massage techniques, learned which oils to use, learned the 100 small ways to make themselves desirable. It was education for a single purpose. Everything they learned, everything they did, was designed to make them more appealing to one man who would probably never see them. Ayşe was terrible at most of it. Her Turkish was improving, but her accent was thick and peasant rough. Her embroidery was a disaster. She couldn't play the oud no matter how many times they showed her. But she learned quickly that incompetence had its own protection. The girls who showed promise, who were beautiful and talented and graceful, those were the ones who attracted attention. Those were the ones the other girls watched with jealous eyes. Those were the ones who sometimes fell mysteriously ill, or woke up with their hair cut off, or found their clothes torn to pieces. The competition was quiet but vicious. Every girl knew that there were hundreds of them, and only one Sultan. The math was brutal. Most of them would never be chosen. Most of them would waste their youth and beauty waiting for something that would never happen. But if you were chosen, if you managed to catch his eye, if you spent even one night in his bed, everything changed. You moved to better quarters. You received better food. You had servants of your own. And if you became pregnant, if you gave him a child, you became almost untouchable. Unless the child was a girl. Daughters were worth something, but not enough. The harem was full of women who had given the Sultan daughters, and then faded back into obscurity, waiting for another chance that never came. But if you had a son, everything changed forever. A son meant power. A son meant you had a stake in the empire's future. Because when the Sultan died, one of his sons would take the throne, and that son's mother would become the new Valide Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. That's what they were all really competing for. Not just a night with the Sultan, not just his fleeting attention. They were competing for the chance to be the mother of the next emperor, to hold real power, to matter. The current Valide Sultan had come from nothing, just like them. She had been a slave girl from somewhere in the Balkans, taken in a raid, brought to the palace. lost among hundreds of other girls. But she had been chosen. She had pleased the old Sultan. She had given him a son, and when that son took the throne, she became the most important person in the empire after him. She controlled the harem with absolute authority. She advised her son on matters of state. She arranged marriages, negotiated treaties, ordered executions. Men bowed to her. Generals consulted her. She had gone from being property to being power, and every girl in the harem knew her story and dreamed of repeating it. But the odds were impossible. The current sultan had been on the throne for 8 years. In that time, he had fathered perhaps 20 children with different women. Most of them had died in infancy. Disease, accidents, weak constitutions. 5 sons had survived past childhood, 3 daughters. And out of the hundreds of women in the harem, only 8 had ever shared his bed. 8 women out of hundreds, and only 3 of those 8 had given him living children. The rest waited, and waited, and slowly went mad with waiting. Hurrem told her stories sometimes, late at night when most of the other girls were asleep. She had been in the harem long enough to hear things, to piece together histories from fragments of gossip. There was a woman named Gulbahar who had given the Sultan his first son, a boy now 7 years old and healthy. Gulbahar lived in apartments Ayşe had never seen, surrounded by servants, draped in silk and jewels. She was untouchable, but she was also terrified, Hurrem said, because the Sultan had other sons now, younger sons from other women, and nobody knew which one he favoured. When the Sultan died, there would be a succession struggle. The sons would fight. Only one could take the throne. And tradition, brutal tradition, said that when a new Sultan took power, he had the right to execute all his brothers to prevent civil war. It had happened before. It would happen again. So Gulbahar lived in golden luxury and never slept soundly, knowing that her son's life depended on being the strongest, the smartest, the favourite. There was another woman named Mahidevran who had given the Sultan a son who died at age 3. She still lived in the harem, but in reduced circumstances, her status elevated by the memory of her dead child, but diminished by her failure to provide another. She spent her days in the gardens, Hurrem said, talking to herself, sometimes laughing at nothing. She was only 25, but she looked 40. Grief had aged her, or maybe it was the knowledge that she had been so close to everything and lost it all. There were women who had been favourites for a year, showered with gifts and attention, only to be discarded when someone, younger and prettier, caught the Sultan's eye. There were women who had spent a single night with him decades ago, and still lived on that memory, still told the story to anyone who would listen, still believed that someday he would call for them again. There were women who had tried to poison their rivals and been strangled quietly in the night, their bodies carried away, their names never mentioned again. The harem was beautiful and deadly. It glittered with possibility and reeked of desperation. And Ayşe was learning, slowly, that survival here meant more than just staying alive. It meant staying invisible until you couldn't afford to be invisible anymore. It meant making no enemies, but also no friends, because friends could betray you, and enemies could destroy you. It meant wanting and not wanting at the same time, hoping and not hoping, living and not living. She had been there 2 months when the first selection night was announced. The word spread through the dormitories like fever. The Valide Sultan had decreed a selection. 40 girls would be chosen to be presented to the Sultan. The chief eunuch would make the choices based on the valide Sultan's preferences. The selection would happen in 3 days. The dormitory erupted into chaos. Girls who had been listless and depressed suddenly became frantic. They scrubbed their skin until it bled. They practiced their Turkish phrases over and over. They tried on different scarves and jewelry, begging opinions from anyone who would give them. They stopped eating, hoping to look more delicate. They pinched their cheeks to bring colour to their faces. They argued over who was prettier, who had a better chance, who the valide Sultan might prefer. Ayşe watched it all with a kind of sick fascination. She didn't think she would be chosen. She wasn't beautiful enough, wasn't graceful enough, wasn't anything enough. She was just a peasant girl from the mountains who could barely speak Turkish and couldn't play any instruments, and whose embroidery looked like a child had done it. Why would the valide Sultan choose her? But on the day of the selection, the chief eunuch came to the dormitory and read out 40 names, and Ayşe's name was one of them. She felt the other girl's eyes on her, hot and hateful. Safiye's name was called too. So was Hurrem's, for the 3rd time. 20 girls from their dormitory, 20 from the other dormitories, 40 out of hundreds. The ones who weren't chosen tried to smile, tried to pretend they didn't care. But Ayşe could see the devastation in their faces. Another month, another year, waiting for the next selection. If there was a next selection. The chosen girls were taken to the baths. They spent hours there, scrubbed and oiled and perfumed, until they smelled like flowers and spices. Their hair was washed with rosewater and combed until it shone. Their nails were trimmed and shaped. Every part of them was examined and improved. The older women who did the work hummed while they scrubbed, utterly indifferent to the girls' fear or excitement. They had done this 1,000 times before. They would do it 1,000 times again. When the bathing was done, they were dressed in silk so fine Ayşe could see her own skin through it. Layers of gauzy fabric in soft colours, pale pink and cream and gold. Jewellery was added, delicate chains and small pearls. Their faces were left bare of cosmetics. The Sultan preferred natural beauty, they were told, or at least that's what his mother preferred him to prefer. They were taken to a room Ayşe had never seen before, a long chamber with a ceiling painted in blue and gold, walls covered in intricate tiles that formed geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move in the lamplight. Cushions were arranged on the floor. Incense burned in brass holders, thick sweet smoke that made her head feel strange and light. The 40 girls stood in a line, silent, trembling, waiting. The valide Sultan entered, first, small and sharp and terrifying. She walked down the line slowly, examining each girl with eyes that revealed nothing. She paused in front of Safiye for a long moment. She touched Hurrem's chin, tilting her face toward the light. She looked at Ayşe and moved on without expression. When she reached the end of the line, she returned to her seat and nodded. The Sultan entered. Ayşe had seen him before, from a distance, walking in the gardens or riding through the palace grounds surrounded by guards and advisors. But she had never been this close to him. He was younger than his mother, perhaps 30, tall and lean, with a carefully trimmed beard and dark eyes that seemed bored and hungry at the same time. He wore simple clothes, no jewels or ornaments, but he moved like a man who carried the weight of empires on his shoulders and had learned to bear it without thinking. He looked tired, That was Ayşe's first thought. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in years. There were shadows under his eyes, lines around his mouth. He walked down the line of women slowly, and Ayşe could see that he wasn't really looking at them. He was performing a duty. This was something his mother wanted, something tradition demanded, but she could see in his face that he would rather be anywhere else. He paused in front of a few girls, asked their names, asked where they were from. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. One girl was so nervous she couldn't answer. She just stood there, shaking until he moved on. Another girl tried to smile at him, and the smile was so desperate and hungry that Ayşe felt embarrassed for her. When he reached Safiye, he stopped. She looked at him with those dead eyes of hers. No fear, no hope, no anything. He studied her face for a long moment. "What is your name?" he asked. "Safiye, my Sultan. Where are you from?" "Georgia. Do you speak Turkish well? I am learning." He nodded and moved on. But Ayşe saw something change in his expression, some small flicker of interest. When he reached the end of the line, he walked back to Safiye and looked at her again. "You," he said, "tonight." The Valide Sultan's face remained expressionless, but Ayşe thought she saw approval in those iron eyes. Safiye bowed her head. The Sultan looked at the rest of them one more time, his gaze moving over their faces without seeing them. And then he left. The Valide Sultan followed him. The eunuchs gestured, and the girls were led away, back to their dormitories, all except Safiye, who was taken in a different direction, toward rooms Ayşe had never seen and never would. The dormitory erupted when they returned. The girls who hadn't been chosen wanted to know everything. Who did he look at? Who did he speak to? Who did he choose? When they learned it was Safiye, the room went quiet. Everyone had expected it to be someone else, someone softer, someone who smiled more. Safiye was beautiful, but she was also cold and strange, and none of them understood why the Sultan had chosen her. Hürrem sat on her bed and stared at the wall. This was her third time being presented, and her third time being passed over. Ayşe wanted to say something comforting, but she didn't know what words could possibly help. What do you say to someone who has just watched their last hope walk away? That night, Ayşe lay in her bed and thought about Safiye. She wondered what was happening to her right now. Was she afraid? Was she excited? Did she feel anything at all? The other girls whispered theories and speculations. Some said the Sultan was gentle. Some said he was rough. Some said he didn't care about the women at all, that he just did his duty and left. Nobody really knew. The women who spent nights with the Sultan never talked about it afterward, and if they did, nobody believed them anyway. Safiye returned 3 days later. She didn't speak to anyone. She moved through the dormitory like a ghost, gathering her few possessions. And then she was taken, away to new quarters. She was Gösta now, noticed, elevated. She would never sleep in the dormitory again. The other girls watched her go, with expressions ranging from envy to hatred to despair. A week later, they learned she was pregnant. The news spread through the harem like wildfire. Pregnant from one night. It happened sometimes, but it was rare enough to feel like a miracle or a curse, depending on who you were. Safiye was moved again, to even better apartments. She was given servants. She was wrapped in silk and treated like precious cargo. Because if the child was a boy, if it survived, she would become her Seki, and her life would be golden forever. The other girls couldn't talk about anything else. How had she done it? What had she said? What had she done? Was it luck, or skill, or something else? Hürrem became bitter and silent. Other girls wept openly. Ayşe just felt numb. She had been chosen for the selection, but the Sultan hadn't even looked at her. She was back to being nobody, back to waiting, back to the endless empty days. Months passed. The palace moved through its rhythms. Summer came and the heat was brutal. Even behind the thick stone walls, the gardens bloomed and withered. The fountains whispered. The Sultan appeared sometimes in the distance, and every woman in the harem stopped what she was doing to watch him pass. There were no more selections. The Valide Sultan was waiting, people said, to see if Safiye's child would be a boy. It was. He was born in the autumn, a healthy son with a strong cry. Safiye became Haseki. She disappeared into the upper levels of the harem, into rooms and privileges Ayşe would never see. And the competition among the remaining women became even more vicious, because now they all knew it was possible. A girl could arrive with nothing, and within a year become one of the most powerful women in the empire. All you needed was one night, one chance, one son. The poisonings started not long after. Nobody talked about it openly, but everyone knew. A girl would fall ill suddenly, vomiting and feverish. Sometimes she recovered, sometimes she didn't. The palace physicians were called, but they could rarely do anything. Food poisoning, they said. Bad water, weak constitution. But the girls knew better. They started watching their food, started eating only what they prepared themselves, started trusting no one. A girl named Layla, pretty and sweet-natured, died in her sleep. They said her heart simply stopped. She was 17. Another girl, Ayşe never learned her name, was found drowned in one of the fountains. An accident, the eunuchs said. She had been walking at night and slipped, but her dormitory mates whispered that she had been pushed, that someone had held her head under water until she stopped struggling. Fear settled over the harem like fog. The girls moved through the corridors with careful eyes, trusting no one, saying nothing. Friendships dissolved. Alliances shifted. Everyone was suspect. Everyone was vulnerable. The eunuchs increased their patrols, but they couldn't watch everyone all the time. The harem was too big, too complex, too full of hidden corners and secret passages. Ayşe learned to sleep lightly. She kept her few possessions under her pillow. She ate only at meals, when everyone was eating the same food from the same kitchen. She spoke to no one unless necessary. She was learning the most important lesson of the harem. Survival meant invisibility. Survival meant being so unremarkable that no one saw you as a threat or a rival. Survival meant giving up hope, because hope made you vulnerable. But she couldn't give it up entirely. None of them could, because every few months there would be another selection, and the cycle would begin again. The frantic preparations, the desperate hope, the crushing disappointment. Ayşe was chosen for 2 more selections over the next year. Both times, the Sultan walked past her without a glance. Both times, she returned to the dormitory, feeling smaller and more invisible than before. Hürrem was chosen 5 times total before she gave up. Ayşe watched her transform slowly from a bitter but hopeful woman into something hollow and dead. She stopped bathing regularly. She stopped eating. She sat in the gardens for hours, staring at nothing. One morning, she simply didn't wake up. The physicians said her heart had stopped. She was 22 years old. They carried her body away and burned her bed. and gave her space to a new girl who arrived that same day, bought at the slave market, renamed, placed in the endless queue. The cycle continued. Girls arrived, girls waited, girls died or disappeared, or were married off to minor officials and sent away. New girls took their places. The harem consumed them all, and nothing changed. Ayşe was 19 when she finally understood that she would never be chosen. 3 years in the harem, and the Sultan had looked at her exactly 0 times. She wasn't beautiful enough. She wasn't interesting enough. She was just another face in a sea of faces, another body in a room full of bodies. She would grow old here, serving the younger girls, watching them hope and fail and die, until one day her own heart stopped, and they burned her bed and forgot her name. The knowledge settled into her bones like winter cold. This was her life now. This was all it would ever be. The golden cage would never open. The Sultan would never see her. She would wait forever for something that would never come. She started spending more time in the gardens. There was a small courtyard at the back of the harem, not as grand as the main gardens, but quieter, less populated. Old fruit trees grew there, their branches heavy in summer, bare in winter. A small fountain bubbled in the center. Stone benches lined the walls. It was a place where the forgotten women went, the ones who had given up, the ones who were just waiting to die. Ayşe would sit there for hours, watching the light change, listening to the fountain, feeling nothing. Sometimes other women joined her. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say. They just sat together in their shared defeat, watching time pass, waiting for the end. It was in that garden that she met Dilara. Dilara was old, maybe 50, maybe older. She had been in the harem for 30 years. She had never been chosen. She had spent her entire adult life waiting for a night that never came. Now she worked in the kitchens, kneading bread, stirring pots, invisible to everyone. But she still came to the garden sometimes, sitting on the same bench Ayşe preferred, feeding breadcrumbs to the birds. They started sitting together, not talking at first, just occupying the same space. Then one day, Dilara spoke. "You remind me of myself," she said, "when I first arrived." Ayşe didn't know what to say to that. "I thought I would be chosen," Dilara continued. "I was pretty then. Not beautiful, but pretty enough. I thought if I just waited long enough, tried hard enough, learned enough, eventually he would see me. Did he?" Dilara laughed, a dry sound like leaves crumbling. "No, 30 years, and he never looked at me once. Not once. Why did you stay?" Dilara shrugged. "Where would I go? I was bought and brought here when I was 14. I don't remember my village. I don't speak my old language anymore. I don't know anything except these walls. This is my home. This is all I have." Ayşe felt something break inside her chest, because she understood. She was becoming Dilara. In 10 years, in 20, in 30, she would be the old woman feeding birds in the garden, her whole life spent waiting for nothing. Too old to leave, too forgotten to matter. "Is it worth it?" she asked. "All the waiting?" Dilara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know. I used to think so. I used to think that even the chance, even the possibility, was worth the price. But now I'm not sure. I gave them my youth. I gave them my life. And for what? For the privilege of growing old in a golden cage, for the honor of being forgotten." She stood up, scattering the last of her breadcrumbs. The birds descended, fighting over the scraps. "But then again," she said, "what else would I have done? Where else would I have gone? At least here I'm fed. At least here I'm safe. That's more than most women get." She walked away, leaving Ayşe alone with the birds and the fountain and the terrible weight of understanding. That night, lying in her bed, listening to the newest girls crying themselves to sleep, Ayşe made a decision. She would stop waiting. She would stop hoping. She would accept what she was. A servant, a nobody, a girl who would grow into a woman, who would grow into an old forgotten ghost haunting the gardens. It would hurt less if she stopped wanting. It would be easier if she just gave up. The next morning, she asked to be transferred to kitchen duty. The request was granted without question. There were always more girls arriving, younger and prettier, and the palace needed workers. She was given a simple brown dress and a headscarf and sent to the kitchens, where she would spend her days kneading dough and stirring pots and scrubbing floors. It was better in some ways. The work was hard, but it kept her mind occupied. She was too tired at the end of the day to think about what she had lost. The kitchen women were kind enough, indifferent enough. They had all been concubines once, all been passed over, all been forgotten. Now they worked, and that was enough. Months blurred into years. Ayşe learned to make bread that rose perfectly, learned which spices the palace preferred, learned how to butcher a lamb and pluck a chicken and prepare the elaborate meals that were sent up to the favourites, to the Haseki, to the Sultan himself. She saw none of it. She just cooked and cleaned and tried not to think. Safiye's son grew healthy and strong. She had another child, a daughter this time. The Sultan visited her occasionally. She was established, secure, untouchable. Other women tried to emulate her success. A girl named Nurbanu was chosen and became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Another woman, Khadija, caught the Sultan's eye and became Gözde. The hierarchy shifted, power moved, alliances formed and broke. Ayşe watched it all from the kitchens, preparing food for women who had succeeded where she had failed and felt nothing. The numbness was complete. She was 23 years old and already dead inside. Then, one morning, everything changed. She was alone in the spice room, measuring out saffron for the evening meal. When she heard footsteps behind her, she turned and found herself face to face with the Sultan. He was alone, no guards, no advisors, just a man who had apparently gotten lost in his own palace and ended up in the kitchens. He looked as surprised to see her as she was to see him. They stared at each other for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I was looking for the garden entrance." His voice was tired. Close up, Ayşe could see the lines around his eyes, the grey threading through his beard. He looked older than his years, worn down by weight she couldn't imagine. "That way," she said, pointing to a corridor. Through the courtyard, past the fountain. "Thank you." He should have left then, but he didn't. He stood there, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Recognition? No, she had never been memorable enough for him to recognize. Curiosity? Maybe. "Have we met?" he asked. "Yes, my Sultan. I was presented to you 4 years ago." He frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, I don't remember. No one does. I wasn't chosen." She said it flatly, without self-pity, just stating a fact. The Sultan studied her face, and she saw something shift in his expression. Guilt? Regret? She didn't know and didn't care. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ayşe." "Where are you from?" "The mountains, near the Black Sea." "But that was a long time ago." He nodded slowly. "You work in the kitchens now, Yes. Do you like it? The question surprised her. No one had ever asked her that before. She thought about lying, about giving the appropriate grateful answer, but she was too tired and too numb to pretend. No, she said, but it's better than waiting. Understanding flickered in his eyes. He knew what she meant. He knew what happened to the women who weren't chosen, how they faded into the background, became invisible, spent their lives serving women who had succeeded where they failed. "I'm sorry," he said again, and somehow that made it worse. His pity, his guilt, his distant compassion for a woman he didn't remember, and would forget again the moment he left this room. She felt something hot and angry rising in her chest, the first real emotion she had felt in years. "Don't be," she said. "This is how it works. You choose a few. The rest of us wait. Some of us wait forever. That's the system. That's what we're here for. Is that what you think? That you're just here to wait? What else is there?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know. I've never thought about it. I suppose I should have." He turned to leave, then paused. "Would you walk with me? To the garden?" It wasn't a request. It was a command from the Sultan. But it was phrased like a question, like he was giving her a choice. She nodded and set down the saffron and led him through the corridors to the small garden where she used to sit with Dilara. It was early morning and the garden was empty. The fountain whispered. Birds sang in the fruit trees. The Sultan sat on one of the stone benches and gestured for her to sit as well. She did, keeping a careful distance, not sure what was happening or why. "Tell me about your village," he said. So she did. She told him about the mountains and the church and her family. She told him about the Tatars and the slave market and the journey to Istanbul. She told him everything, not because she wanted to share it, but because he had commanded, and she had no choice. But as she talked, she felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of grief and anger that had been strangling her for years. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat in silence for a while, staring at the fountain. "I'm sorry," he said, for the third time. "I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry you're here. Then let me go." The words came out before she could stop them. Bold, dangerous. You didn't tell the Sultan what to do. But she had already broken every rule by speaking honestly, so why stop now? He looked at her with something like surprise. "You want to leave?" "Yes." "Where would you go?" "I don't know. Anywhere. Back to my village, if it still exists. To some other city. Anywhere but here. You understand that's impossible. You belong to the palace now. I belong to nothing. I'm property that no one wants. Let me go and you lose nothing." He shook his head slowly. "It doesn't work that way. There are rules, traditions that keep hundreds of women locked in golden cages, waiting for something that will never happen." "Yes, then your traditions are cruel." He flinched like she had struck him. Maybe she had. Maybe no one had ever said it so plainly before. The Sultan, the most powerful man in the empire, sitting on a bench in a forgotten garden, being lectured about cruelty by a kitchen servant. "You're right," he said finally. "They are cruel. But I didn't create them. I inherited them. And I don't know how to change them without breaking everything else. Then everything else deserves to be broken." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're braver than most of my advisors. I have nothing left to lose. Everyone has something to lose. Not me. I've already lost everything. My family, my freedom, my life. What more can you take?" He stood up, and she thought he would leave now. angry or offended, or simply done with this strange conversation. But instead he said, "I'll think about what you said." Then he walked away, back toward the main palace, leaving her alone in the garden. Ayşe sat there for a long time, her heart pounding. What had she done? She had spoken to the Sultan like an equal, had criticized him, had demanded her freedom. She would be punished for this. She would be beaten or locked away or worse. But days passed and nothing happened. No eunuchs came to drag her away. No one mentioned her conversation with the Sultan. She went back to the kitchens, back to her work, and life continued as before. She thought maybe she had imagined it. Maybe the exhaustion and grief had finally broken her mind, and she had hallucinated the whole thing. But then, 2 weeks later, she was summoned. Not to the selection rooms, not to the baths, to an office in the administrative wing where a scribe sat with papers spread before him. The chief eunuch was there too, his face unreadable. "You are being released," the scribe said, "by order of the Sultan." Ayşe stared at him. "Released? You will be given a small house in the city and a modest pension. You are free to go." She couldn't breathe. This didn't happen. Women didn't leave the harem except to die, or to be married off. They didn't just walk out free. Why? She managed to ask. The scribe shrugged. The Sultan didn't explain his reasons. He gave the order. "We obey." The chief eunuch looked at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been pity. "You spoke truth to power," he said quietly. "Few people do that. Even fewer survive it. You should leave before he changes his mind." So she did. They gave her simple clothes, a purse of coins, directions to a house near the docks. They escorted her to the gates, and then pushed her through and closed them behind her. Ayşe stood in the street, free for the first time in 4 years, and didn't know what to do. The city roared around her, huge and overwhelming and terrifying. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no idea how to survive in a world that had forgotten her. But she was free. She walked through Istanbul for hours, just walking, feeling the weight of the golden cage lifting with every step. The house they had given her was small, barely more than a room with a sleeping mat and a cooking fire. But it was hers. The pension was tiny, but it was enough for bread and cheese and sometimes meat. She could work if she wanted to. She could leave if she wanted to. She could do anything. The first night in her own house, she lay on the mat and cried. Not from grief this time, but from relief so profound it felt like drowning. She had escaped. Against all odds, against all traditions, she had escaped the golden cage. Years later, she would hear stories about the harem, about selections and poisonings and power struggles, about women who succeeded and women who failed, about the endless cycle of hope and despair. And she would remember the hundreds of women still locked in those beautiful rooms, still waiting for a man who would probably never see them, still competing for scraps of attention and power. She would remember Hürrem and Dilara and all the nameless girls who had died waiting. And she would be grateful, every single day, that she had been brave enough to speak the truth, and lucky enough that someone had listened. She would remember Hürrem and Dilara and all the nameless girls who had died waiting. And she would be grateful, every single day, that she had been brave enough to speak the truth, and lucky enough that someone had listened. But those thoughts came later. In the beginning, freedom was terrifying. Ayşe woke every morning in her small house near the docks and felt disoriented, lost, like she had been dropped into a foreign country where she didn't know the language or the customs. The city was enormous and loud and chaotic. Men and women moved through the streets freely, buying and selling, arguing and laughing, living lives that seemed impossibly complex after 4 years of captivity. She had forgotten how to be a person in the world. She had only known how to be property. The first few weeks, she barely left her house. She ate the bread and cheese she bought from the baker down the street and sat in her single room, listening to the sounds of the city outside her window. Ships in the harbour, merchants calling their wares, children playing, dogs barking, the call to prayer 5 times a day, echoing across the rooftops. All of it was overwhelming. All of it made her want to hide. But the pension was small, and she knew it wouldn't last forever. She needed to work. She needed to figure out how to survive. So she started venturing out, first just to the market, then further into the city, learning the streets, learning where things were, learning how people lived when they weren't locked in golden cages. She found work, eventually, in a bakery run by an old woman named Fatma, who asked no questions and paid in bread and a few coins. The work was familiar, kneading dough, shaping loaves, tending the ovens. Her hands remembered what to do, even if her mind was still adjusting to freedom. Fatma was kind in a gruff, distant way, the kindness of someone who had seen too much suffering to be surprised by anything anymore. She let Ayşe work in silence, never pushing her to talk, never asking about her past. Months passed. Ayşe learned the rhythms of the bakery, learned Fatma's preferences, learned which customers were kind and which were rude, and which tried to cheat on the price. She learned to navigate the market, to bargain for vegetables and oil, to carry water from the public fountain. She learned to sleep through the noise of the city, to wake with the first call to prayer, to move through her days with a kind of numb efficiency. She didn't make friends. She didn't try to. The other women in the neighborhood were curious about her. This quiet girl who lived alone and had no family and never explained where she came from. They gossiped about her, she knew, spinning stories to fill the gaps in her history. Some thought she was a widow. Some thought she had been cast out by her family. Some thought she was running from something or someone. None of them guessed the truth, because the truth was too strange, too unlikely. Who would believe that she had been in the Sultan's harem and been released? It didn't happen. It was impossible. But it had happened. And sometimes, lying in her narrow bed at night, she still couldn't believe it was real. Sometimes she woke up expecting to see the dormitory around her, to hear the breathing of 100 other girls, to smell the rosewater and perfume. Sometimes she reached for the familiar shapes of that life and found only absence, only silence, only the small empty room that was hers alone. She had been free for almost a year when she saw Dilara again. It was market day, and Ayşe was buying onions when she noticed an old woman standing near the fruit seller's stall. She was bent and thin, wearing a faded headscarf, and there was something familiar about the way she moved, careful and slow, like someone whose bones hurt. Ayşe looked closer and felt her heart stop. It was Dilara, the woman from the garden, the woman who had spent 30 years in the harem waiting for nothing. Ayşe stood frozen, not sure what to do. Part of her wanted to walk away, to pretend she hadn't seen, to leave that part of her life buried. But Dilara looked up, and their eyes met, and recognition flickered across her face. "Ayşe," Dilara said. Her voice was rougher than Ayşe remembered, worn down by time. "Dilara." They stood there in the market, two women who had shared the same prison, staring at each other across a distance that felt both vast and impossibly small. "You got out," Dilara said finally. "Yes." "How?" Ayşe didn't know how to explain it. The conversation with the Sultan, strange mercy, impossible freedom. So she just said, "I asked." Dilara laughed, that same dry, crumbling sound. "I asked 1,000 times. He never heard me. I was lucky. Yes, you were." They stood in awkward silence. Then Dilara said, "I was released 6 months ago, too old to be useful anymore. They gave me a tiny pension and sent me away. I live near the fish market now, alone." Ayşe felt something tighten in her chest. Dilara had spent 30 years in the harem, and in the end, they had simply discarded her, used up and forgotten. This was what awaited all the women who weren't chosen, who didn't bear sons, who didn't climb the hierarchy. Eventually, you aged out of even being a useful servant, and they pushed you out the gates with a handful of coins and nothing else. "Do you have enough?" Ayşe asked. "To live?" Dilara shrugged. "I get by. I do washing for people sometimes. It's enough. If you need anything." Dilara smiled, a real smile this time. "That's kind, but I'm used to having nothing. This isn't so different." She started to walk away, then paused. "You know what the worst part is? Not the poverty, not being alone. It's that I still dream I'm there. Every night, I dream I'm back in the harem, waiting for him to choose me. And when I wake up, I don't know if I'm relieved or disappointed." She disappeared into the crowd before Ayşe could respond. That encounter haunted Ayşe for weeks. She kept thinking about all the women still in the harem, still waiting. And all the women who would eventually be released like Dilara, broken and empty, and unable to escape even in their dreams. She had been lucky, impossibly lucky, but her luck didn't change the system. The golden cage was still there. Women were still being bought and brought there. The cycle continued. She thought about going back, about finding a way to help. But what could she do? She was nobody. She had no power, no influence, no way to change anything. The best she could do was survive her own freedom and try not to think too much about the women she had left behind. The bakery became her anchor. The work was repetitive and physical, and it kept her mind from wandering too far into dark places. Fatma relied on her more and more, teaching her recipes, trusting her with the books, treating her almost like a daughter. When Fatma's arthritis got bad, Ayşe took over more of the work. When Fatma died 2 years after Ayşe started working there, she left the bakery to Ayşe in her will. Suddenly, Ayşe owned something, a business, a livelihood, a place in the world that was hers by right, not by ownership or captivity. She was 26 years old, and she had a bakery. She kept it running, kept the ovens hot and the bread fresh. She hired a girl to help, a thin, nervous thing, who reminded her of herself at 15, and she was kind to her in ways no one had been kind to Ayşe. She paid fair wages. She didn't ask questions. She gave the girl a place to be safe. The neighborhood accepted her eventually. She was the baker, the quiet woman who made good bread and minded her own business. She went to the hammam once a week like other women. She bought vegetables at the market. She lived a normal life, or as normal as she could manage, with the weight of 4 years in the harem, pressing on her shoulders like an invisible burden. She was 28 when she met Mehmet. He was a carpenter who came to fix the door of the bakery when the hinges broke. He was perhaps 30, quiet and careful, with hands that were calloused from work and eyes that were kind. He fixed the door and charged her a fair price and left. A week later, he came back to buy bread. Then he came back again and again. Ayşe knew what was happening, but she didn't know how to respond. She had never been courted. She had never been treated like a woman who could be desired for herself, not for what she could give a sultan, not as property to be evaluated and chosen or discarded. Mehmet looked at her like she was a person, like she mattered. It terrified her. But he was patient. He came to the bakery and bought bread and talked to her about small things, the weather, the neighborhood, his work. He never pushed. He never demanded. He just existed in her life, steady and reliable and safe. After 6 months of this careful courtship, he asked if he could walk her home from the market. She said yes. They walked in silence mostly, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind shared between people who didn't need words to fill every moment. At her door, he said, "I know you have a past you don't talk about. I don't need to know it. I just want to know if there's a future where you might consider marrying me." Ayşe stared at him. Marriage. She had never imagined it. In the harem, marriage was what happened to failures, to women who couldn't attract the Sultan and were given away to minor officials as consolation prizes. But this wasn't that. This was a man asking her, not being given her. A man who wanted her, not because she was beautiful or useful or capable of bearing sons, but because he liked her bread and her silence and the way she moved through the world. "I need time," she said. "I have time." And he did. He waited another year while she wrestled with the idea, while she tried to imagine a life that included someone else, while she slowly let down the walls she'd built to survive captivity. He was patient and kind, and never once made her feel like she owed him anything. When she finally said yes, they were married quietly in a small ceremony, with a handful of neighbors as witnesses. No grand celebration, no expensive gifts, just two people choosing each other, which was revolutionary in its simplicity. Mehmet moved into her small house, and it became their house. He built shelves and repaired the roof and fixed the things that were broken. She cooked and baked and learned to share her space with another human being. It was strange and awkward at first. She woke sometimes in the night, panicked, forgetting where she was, expecting to see the dormitory. But Mehmet was patient with her panic, with her nightmares, with the ways the harem had damaged her. He never asked about her past directly, but sometimes she told him pieces of it. Small fragments, the slave market, the endless waiting, the fear. He listened without judgment, without pity, just accepting that these things had happened, and she had survived them. They had been married 2 years when she became pregnant. The fear was immediate and overwhelming. She had spent 4 years in the harem, watching women destroy each other over pregnancies, over sons, over the desperate hope that a child would save them. She had seen women lose babies and lose their minds. She had seen the darkness that came with childbearing in that place. But this wasn't the harem. This was her life, her choice, her child. Mehmet was excited in his quiet way, building a cradle, preparing the house, being gentle with her in ways that made her want to cry. The pregnancy was difficult. She was sick constantly, weak and exhausted. The midwife who attended her was concerned about her age. 29 was old for a first child. And about her thinness, years of poor eating in the harem. And then poverty had left her body undernourished. But Ayşe was determined to survive this, to bring this child into the world, to prove that life could exist outside the golden cage. The labour was long and brutal. She screamed herself hoarse, certain she was dying, certain this was how it ended. But then the midwife was placing a small wrinkled creature in her arms and saying, "It's a girl. You have a daughter." A daughter. In the harem, daughters were disappointments. They were proof you had failed to give the Sultan what he really wanted. But here, in this small house, with this kind man, a daughter was perfect. Ayşe looked at her child's tiny face and felt something crack open in her chest. Some hard shell she had built around her heart to survive. They named her Elif. She was small and loud and perfect. Mehmet adored her, carrying her around the house, singing to her in his rough carpenter's voice, being the kind of father Ayşe had barely remembered existed. Ayşe learned to be a mother, learned to feed and soothe and protect. She learned that love could exist without competition, without jealousy, without the fear that someone would poison your child to advance their own. Elif was hers, and no one could take her away. The bakery continued. Ayşe worked with Elif strapped to her back, kneading dough while the baby slept, singing the songs her own mother had sung to her in the mountains. Mehmet built an addition to the house so Elif could have her own small room. Life was hard, but it was theirs, and it was real. When Elif was 3, Ayşe became pregnant again. This time it was easier. Her body knew what to do. She gave birth to a son they named Yusuf, then another daughter, Zeynep, then another son, Ibrahim. 4 children in 7 years, a full house, chaos and noise and life. The children never knew about the harem. Ayşe never told them. As far as they knew, their mother had always been the baker, had always been married to their father, had always lived in this house. The past was buried deep, and she intended to keep it there. But sometimes she would see something, a girl being led through the market in chains, a merchant, evaluating a young woman like livestock, and she would remember. She would remember the feeling of being property, of being powerless, of waiting for someone to choose you or discard you on a whim. She gave money when she could, to women who needed it, to girls trying to escape bad situations. She hired women who had nowhere else to go. She created the safety she wished someone had created for her. Mehmet died when Ayşe was 45, a construction accident, a beam that fell wrong, and he was gone. The grief was enormous and terrible, but different from the grief she had known in the harem. This was the grief of losing someone who had chosen you, and loved you, and built a life with you. This was the grief that came from real connection, not from the loss of possibility. Her children were nearly grown. Elif was 21, and engaged to a merchant's son. Yusuf was working as an apprentice carpenter like his father. The younger 2 were still home, but old enough to help with the bakery. Ayşe mourned her husband, and kept working, kept living, kept moving forward. She was 50 when she heard that the Sultan had died. The news spread through the city like fire. The Sultan, who had ruled for 30 years, was dead. There would be a succession. His sons would fight for the throne. The empire held its breath, waiting to see which one would survive. Ayşe stood in her bakery kneading dough, and thought about all the women in the harem, all the mothers of sons, who were now waiting to see if their child would live or die. The tradition was brutal. When a new sultan took power, he executed all his brothers to prevent civil war. It had happened before. It would happen again. She thought about Safiye, the cold-eyed girl who had been chosen that night so long ago, who had given birth to a son in that first year. That son would be nearly 30 now, one of the princes competing for power. She thought about all the other women who had borne sons, who had loved them and raised them, and now had to watch them fight and possibly die. The succession struggle lasted 3 months. 2 princes died in battle. 1 was executed. 1 disappeared, probably murdered quietly. In the end, the oldest son, Safiye's son, took the throne. He was sultan now. And Safiye, the strange, quiet girl from Georgia, became Valid Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. Ayşe wondered if Safiye remembered the dormitory, the nights of waiting, the fear. She wondered if power had erased those memories, or if they still haunted her. She wondered if Safiye ever thought about all the women still locked in the harem, still waiting, still competing for scraps of attention. The new sultan, following tradition, executed his surviving brothers. Their mothers were given positions of honor, pensions, respect. But their sons were dead, and no amount of gold could bring them back. Ayşe thought about Gulbahar, the woman who had given the old sultan his first son. That boy was dead now, murdered, to secure the throne for Safiye's child. Gulbahar had lived in luxury 4 decades, raising her son, loving him, believing he would be sultan one day. And now he was gone, and she had nothing. This was the price of the harem. This was what women competed for. Not just a night with the sultan, not just wealth and status. They competed for the chance to watch their sons die in succession struggles, to live long enough to see everything they had fought for destroyed. Ayşe was glad she had escaped, glad her children were merchants and carpenters, not princes. Glad they would live ordinary lives, marry ordinary people, have ordinary problems. Ordinary was a blessing she had learned to treasure. She was 60 when Dilara died. Ayşe heard about it from a neighbor who mentioned that an old woman who lived near the fish market had been found dead in her room. She had died alone, probably days before anyone noticed. The description matched Dilara perfectly. Ayşe went to the funeral. A small, sad affair attended by almost no one. Dilara had died as she had lived, forgotten and alone. Ayşe stood at the grave and thought about the 30 years Dilara had spent waiting, the decades of hope that slowly died, the dreams that never came true. She thought about all the women like Dilara, who gave their lives to the harem and received nothing in return. She wondered if the system would ever change, if some future sultan would look at the cruelty and decide it was too much. But she doubted it. Tradition was powerful. The harem was too useful, too embedded in the structure of power. It would continue long after she was dead, consuming women, spitting out the ones it didn't want, destroying even the ones it elevated. Ayşe was 72 when she closed the bakery for the last time. Her hands were too arthritic to knead dough anymore. Her children were grown with children of their own. Elif ran a successful textile business. Yusuf had taken over his father's carpentry shop. The Kul, younger ones, had married well. They wanted her to live with them, to be cared for, but Ayşe preferred her small house, her independence, the life she had built from nothing. She spent her days sitting in her doorway, watching the city move past. She was old now, her hair white, her body worn down by decades of work. But she was free. She had been free for 50 years. She had built a life, raised children, loved a good man, survived. Sometimes, young women would stop to buy bread from the girl who had taken over the bakery next door. And Ayşe would see in their faces the same fear and uncertainty she had felt at 15. She would see girls being sold, being bought, being moved through the city like property. And she would feel the old anger rise up, still hot after all these years. She started talking to the young women when she could, warning them, telling them to be careful, offering them work if they needed it, a place to stay if they were running. She couldn't save everyone, but she could save someone, and that was better than nothing. One day, a girl showed up at her door, thin and terrified, with bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes. She'd escaped from somewhere, she wouldn't say where, and she needed help. Ayşe took her in, fed her, let her sleep in the small room that had been Zeynep's, asked no questions. The girl stayed for a week, then 2 weeks, then a month. Slowly, she began to talk. She had been sold to a merchant who beat her. She had run away. She had nowhere to go. Ayşe gave her work in the textile shop Elif ran, gave her a safe place, gave her the chance to build something new. The girl thrived. Within a year, she was managing part of the business. Within 2 years, she had married a kind young man and moved into her own house. She came to visit Ayşe regularly, bringing her grandchildren, calling her grandmother, even though they shared no blood. This became Ayşe's final project, taking in girls who needed help, giving them safety, giving them the chance she had been given, the chance to escape, to build, to live. She saved 11 women over the next decade. 11 women who might have been destroyed by the systems that consumed so many. 11 women who got to choose their own lives. Ayşe was 84 when she died. It was winter, and she caught a fever that her old body couldn't fight. Her children gathered around her bed, along with the women she had saved, and their children. The small house was full of people, full of life, full of proof that escape was possible. In her final moments, she thought about the harem, about the golden cage, about all the women still locked inside, still waiting, still competing, about Safiye, who had won everything and lost her humanity, about Gulbahar, who had lost everything she loved, about Hurrem and Dilara and all the forgotten names. She thought about the girl she had been, terrified and alone, watching the Sultan walk past without seeing her. And she thought about the woman she had become, free and whole and surrounded by love. The harem had tried to break her, had tried to make her nothing, had tried to convince her that her only value was in being chosen by a man who would never see her. But she had escaped. She had survived. She had built a life that mattered, not because a sultan chose her, but because she chose herself. The golden cage was still there. Women were still locked inside. The system continued. But Ayşe had proven something important. Escape was possible. Freedom was possible. A life outside the cage was possible. She died knowing that. Died surrounded by proof of it. Died free. And somewhere in the harem, new girls were arriving, being scrubbed and renamed, and placed in dormitories to wait. The cycle continued. It always continued. But maybe, somewhere, one of them would be brave enough to speak the truth. One of them would be lucky enough to be heard. One of them would escape and build something real and save someone else who needed saving. Maybe the golden cage would someday be empty. Maybe someday no woman would have to compete for the attention of one man to have value. Maybe someday, freedom would be the default, not the miracle. Ayşe died believing it was possible, even if she would never see it. Her children buried her in a simple grave with a simple stone. The women she had saved came to the funeral and told their stories. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren she had never expected to have stood around her grave and promised to remember. They didn't know about the harem. They didn't know she had been property once. They just knew she had been brave and kind and free. And maybe that was enough. Maybe being remembered as free was the greatest victory of all. The harem continued for another century after Ayşe died, then another. Slowly, painfully, it began to change. The world changed around it. Ideas about women changed. The empire itself changed, and eventually fell. The golden cage was finally dismantled in the early 20th century. The last women were released. The palace became a museum. The dormitories, where hundreds of women had waited, became empty rooms that tourists walked through, taking pictures, marveling at the beautiful tiles and fountains, never quite understanding the suffering that had happened there. Some of the women who were released adapted to freedom. Some never did. Some had spent so long in captivity that the outside world was incomprehensible. They had been broken by the waiting, by the competition, by the knowledge that their entire value rested in the body of a man who didn't know they existed. But some thrived, some built lives, some saved others. Some passed down stories of survival and resistance. And in those stories, if you listened carefully, you could hear echoes of Ayşe, the girl who spoke truth to power, the woman who chose herself, the survivor who turned her escape into a mission to help others escape. The harem was gone, but its lessons remained. The golden cage was dismantled, but its shadow lingered. Women still competed for male attention. Women still measured their worth by whether they were chosen. Women still waited for permission to live their own lives. But there were also women who refused to wait. Women who spoke up. Women who chose themselves. Women who built something real outside the cages society tried to put them in. They were Ayşe's children, whether they knew it or not. And the fight she had started, the simple revolutionary act of demanding freedom, continued long after she was dust, because some truths are too powerful to die. Some freedoms, once tasted, can never be forgotten. Some voices, once raised, echo forever. The golden cage was empty now. The Sultan was gone. The empire was history. But the women who had survived, who had escaped, who had chosen themselves over the promise of power, they remained in memory and story, and the fierce determination of every woman who refused to wait for someone else to give her value. Ayşe had been one of hundreds, anonymous, forgettable, a girl from a village without a name. But she had lived, she had escaped, she had mattered, and that was enough. That was everything. That was everything. That was the whole impossible truth of it. A girl who had been property became a person. A slave became free. A number became a name. The years after Mehmet's death were the hardest in some ways. Not because Ayşe was alone. She had been alone before and survived it. But because she had to relearn how to exist without him. For 17 years he had been there, steady and reliable, a presence that anchored her to the world. Without him, the house felt too big and too empty, even though her children visited constantly, bringing grandchildren, bringing noise and life. Elif worried the most. She came every day at first, bringing food, insisting her mother eat, checking that she was managing. Ayşe appreciated the concern, but also found it suffocating. She had survived the harem. She had survived slavery and loss, and 4 years of waiting to be chosen by a man who never saw her. She could survive widowhood. But Elif didn't understand that. How could she? Ayşe had never told her children about the harem, about what she had endured before they were born. To them, she was just their mother, the baker, the woman who had always been there with bread in the oven and practical advice. They didn't know about the golden cage. They didn't know about the girls who died waiting. They didn't know their mother had once been property. Sometimes, Ayşe thought about telling them, sitting them down and explaining where she had really come from, what had really happened to her. But every time she considered it, the words stuck in her throat. What would she say? How would she explain the harem to children who had grown up free, who had never known what it meant to be owned? So she kept the secret and let them think she had always been strong, had always known how to survive. It was easier that way, less complicated. The neighborhood changed around her. Old families moved away or died. New families arrived. The city grew larger, sprawling beyond its old boundaries. The Sultan's palace remained on its hill, overlooking the Bosphorus, massive and eternal. And Ayşe tried not to look at it when she went to market, tried not to think about the women still locked inside, tried not to imagine which ones were waiting and which ones had given up. She heard news sometimes, filtered through market gossip and neighbors who knew someone who knew someone. The new Sultan, Safiye's son, had consolidated power. He had executed his rivals. He had taken his own concubines, started his own harem within the harem. The cycle continued. Women were still being bought. Girls were still being brought to the palace. The golden cage still existed, still consumed, still destroyed. Nothing had changed except that Ayşe was no longer part of it. When she was 55, a woman came to the bakery asking for work. She was perhaps 40, thin and worn, with eyes that had seen too much. She said her name was Esma, and she needed employment. Any employment. She would do anything. There was something familiar about her, something in the way she held herself, careful and small, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Ayşe hired her to help with the cleaning, with the tasks that Ayşe's arthritic hands struggled with. Esma was grateful and quiet and efficient. She never talked about herself. She never explained where she had come from, or why she needed work so desperately. She just appeared every morning, worked hard, took her wages, and disappeared. They worked together for 3 months before Ayşe finally asked, "You were in the harem, weren't you?" Esma froze, her hands still on the broom she was holding. Then slowly she nodded. How long? 18 years. Ayşe felt her chest tighten. 18 years. Almost 2 decades of waiting. And then what? Released, married off, escaped. They married me to a minor official, Esma said quietly. A man who worked in the tax office. It was supposed to be an honor. I was supposed to be grateful. He was old and mean, and he drank too much. He died last year and left me nothing. His family took everything. So here I am. Here you are, Ayşe echoed. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Ayşe said, I was there too. 4 years. I was released. Esma looked at her with sudden intensity. Released? Not married off? Just released? Yes. That doesn't happen, I know. But it did. How? Ayşe told her the story, the conversation with the Sultan, the demand for freedom, the impossible mercy. Esma listened without interrupting, her eyes getting wider and wider. You spoke to him like that. You told him the traditions were cruel. Yes. And he didn't have you executed? No, he let me go. Esma sat down heavily on a flour sack. I spent 18 years being silent, she said, being obedient, doing everything they told me, learning Turkish and Persian, learning to play the ney until my fingers bled, making myself smaller and quieter and more perfect. And none of it mattered. He never chose me, not once. And you talked back to him, and he set you free. She started laughing, a bitter sound that turned into crying. Ayşe knelt beside her old knees protesting, and held her while she sobbed. I wasted my life, Esma said through the tears. I gave them everything and got nothing. You survived, Ayşe said. You're here. You're alive. That's not nothing. But what kind of life is this? Working for pennies, living in a rented room, no family, no future, just existing until I die. Ayşe didn't have an answer for that, because Esma was right. The harem had taken her youth and her hope and given her nothing in return. She had been released into a world that had no place for middle-aged women with no skills except those designed to please a man who never wanted them. Esma kept working at the bakery. She and Ayşe developed a quiet friendship built on shared experience and mutual understanding. They didn't talk about the harem much. There was no need. They both knew what it had been like. They both carried the same scars. Other women found their way to Ayşe over the years. Women who had been released or escaped or married off and then widowed. Women who had nowhere else to go. Ayşe helped when she could, gave them work, gave them connections, gave them the support she wished had existed when she first stumbled out of the palace gates into a world she didn't understand. She became known, quietly, as someone who helped women. Not loudly, not publicly. But if you knew where to look, if you knew who to ask, you could find the old baker who would give you work without questions, who would let you sleep in her back room until you found your feet, who understood what it meant to have your whole life stolen and have to build something new from nothing. When Ayşe was 63, a girl showed up at her door in the middle of the night. She was maybe 17, bleeding from a cut on her arm, terrified and shaking. She said she had escaped from the harem. She had climbed a wall and run through the city, and someone had told her to find the old baker who helped women. Ayşe pulled her inside, cleaned the wound, fed her, let her sleep. In the morning, the girl told her story. She had been in the harem for 2 years. She had been chosen for a selection. The Sultan had picked her. She had spent a night with him. And then she'd been sent back to wait, to see if she was pregnant. She wasn't pregnant. But another woman in the harem was. A woman who saw her as competition. That woman had paid a eunuch to arrange an accident. The girl had been pushed downstairs. She had broken her arm. When it healed badly, crooked and weak, she became useless. Damaged goods. They were going to send her away to a provincial palace, basically exile, basically a slow death in a forgotten corner of the empire. So she had run. Ayşe listened to this story and felt the old anger burning in her chest. Nothing had changed. The harem was still destroying women, still pitting them against each other, still treating them like objects to be used and discarded. You can't stay here, Ayşe said. They'll be looking for you. If they find you, they'll find me, and I can't protect you from the palace. I know, the girl said. I just needed somewhere safe for one night. I'm going to leave the city. I have family in Anatolia. If I can get there, if I can disappear. Ayşe thought for a moment. Then she said, I know someone, a merchant who travels inland regularly. He owes me a favour. I'll ask him to take you. She did. The merchant, who had been buying bread from Ayşe for 20 years, agreed without questions. He hid the girl in his cart among the spices and textiles, and took her out of Istanbul. Ayşe never saw her again, but she heard, years later, that a woman matching her description had opened a small shop in a town near Ankara. She hoped it was true. She hoped the girl had made it. But she knew that for everyone who escaped, hundreds more were still trapped. The golden cage was vast, and its appetite was endless. Ayşe was 68 when she started writing things down. Not a full memoir. She didn't have the education for that, but fragments, memories, stories of the women she had known. She wrote in simple Turkish on whatever paper she could find, keeping the pages in a box under her bed. She wrote about Hürrem, who had been chosen 5 times and died at 22. She wrote about Dilara, who had waited 30 years for nothing. She wrote about Safiye and Gulbahar and Mahidevran and all the other women whose names she remembered. She wrote about the poisonings and the drownings and the girls who went mad from waiting. She wrote about the Sultan who had let her go, wondering sometimes if he even remembered doing it, if it had meant anything to him, or if it was just a momentary impulse he forgot immediately. She wrote about freedom and what it cost and what it was worth. She didn't know why she was writing. Maybe she just needed to put it somewhere, outside her own head. Maybe she needed proof that it had all been real. Maybe she hoped someone, someday, would read it and understand what the harem really was, beyond the romance and mystery that people imagined. Her children found the box after she died. Elif read the pages with shaking hands, finally understanding where her mother had come from, what she had survived. She showed them to her siblings. They were shocked and heartbroken and proud all at once. They kept the pages, passed them down, made copies. The story spread slowly, quietly, through the family. Ayşe's great-great-grandchildren knew they descended from a woman who had been a slave in the Sultan's harem and had escaped and built a life and saved other women. It became part of the family history, a source of pride, a reminder that survival was possible even when everything seemed impossible. But that was later. In the moment, Ayşe just wrote because she needed to, because the memories were heavy and writing them down made them lighter, because she wanted someone to know, someday, that they had existed. All those women, all those lives, all that suffering. When she was 70, Ayşe's health started failing. Her heart was weak. Her breathing was laboured. She'd lived a long life, longer than most women of her time, but it was coming to an end. Elif wanted her to move in, to be cared for, but Ayşe refused. She wanted to die in her own house, the house she had been given when she was freed, the house where she had raised her children, the house that was hers. The women she had helped over the years came to visit. Esma, still alive at 70, still working despite her age. The girl from Georgia, who had been beaten by her master and whom Ayşe had saved. A dozen others, women who had been lost and whom Ayşe had helped find their way. They sat with her, brought her food she couldn't eat, told her stories, reminded her that she had mattered, that she had made a difference, that she had saved lives. In her last days, Ayşe dreamed about the harem. Not nightmares exactly, but memories that felt more real than the present. She dreamed about the dormitory, about the breathing of 100 girls in the darkness. She dreamed about the baths, the scrubbing, the endless preparation for a moment that might never come. She dreamed about the fountain where the mad woman had drowned, about the gardens where she had sat with Dilara, about the selection rooms where the Sultan had walked past her without seeing her. She dreamed about the moment she had spoken to him, told him the truth, demanded her freedom. In her dreams, he looked different, younger or older, or kinder or crueler. The details shifted and changed, but the core remained the same. She had spoken, he had listened, she had been freed. Sometimes she wondered if it had really happened, or if it was just a story she had told herself so many times it felt true. But then she would wake up in her own house, surrounded by evidence of the life she had built, and she would know it was real. She died on a cold morning in winter, with Elif holding one hand and Esma holding the other. Her last words were in the language of her childhood, the mountain dialect she hadn't spoken in 60 years, calling for her mother. The funeral was large. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the women she had saved, the neighbours who had known her for decades. They buried her in a cemetery overlooking the Bosphorus, near but not too near the palace that had once held her captive. Elif made sure the headstone said something true, not just the dates of her birth and death, but a single line. She lived free. That was enough. That was everything. The harem continued for another 50 years after Ayşe's death. The traditions held. Women were still bought and sold. The Sultan still chose concubines. Sons were still born and raised and pitted against each other. The cycle continued because systems like that don't end easily. They have too much weight, too much history, too many people invested in maintaining them. But cracks were forming. The world was changing. Ideas about women were changing. Slowly, painfully slowly, but changing nonetheless. There were reformers who argued that the harem was barbaric, outdated, cruel. There were women who refused to send their daughters there. There were men who questioned whether buying and selling human beings was compatible with the empire's future. The arguments went on for decades. The harem was defended by traditionalists who said it was part of the empire's identity, part of what made them strong. They said the women were honoured, protected, given luxury and status they would never have otherwise. They said it wasn't slavery, it was opportunity. But the women knew better. The ones who had been there, who had lived through it, who carried the scars. They knew it was a cage, no matter how golden. They knew it destroyed more than it elevated. They knew the real price. Some of them started speaking out. Not many. It was dangerous to criticize the palace. But a few brave women told their stories, published them, shared them, let the world know what really happened behind those beautiful walls. And slowly, very slowly, public opinion began to shift. The final end came not through reform, but through revolution. The empire fell. The sultanate was abolished. The palace became a museum. And the harem, that ancient institution, that golden cage that had consumed so many women for so many centuries, was finally dismantled. The last concubines were released. Some were old women who had spent their entire lives there. Some were young girls who had just arrived. They walked out through the gates that had held them prisoner and into a world that had no idea what to do with them. Many struggled. They had no skills, no family, no support. They had been raised to please one man, and now that man was gone, and they were left with nothing. Some ended up in poverty, some in brothels, a different kind of captivity. Some disappeared entirely, but some survived. Some built lives. Some found work and homes and dignity. Some married and had children and tried to forget the years they spent waiting. And some remembered. Some told their stories. Some made sure the world knew what had happened in that beautiful, terrible place. Ayşe's story was among them. Her great-great-granddaughter published the fragments she had written, adding context and history, turning them into a small book that circulated among scholars and feminists and people who wanted to understand what the harem had really been. It wasn't a bestseller, it wasn't famous, but it mattered to the people who read it. It gave them insight into a world that had been hidden, into suffering that had been romanticized, into lives that had been erased. And somewhere in those pages was the core truth that Ayşe had lived and died believing. Freedom is possible. Escape is possible. Survival is possible, even when you're property, even when you're powerless, even when the whole system is designed to break you. You can still speak truth to power. You can still demand your humanity. You can still choose yourself. It won't always work. It didn't work for Hürrem or Dilara or the hundreds of others who died waiting. But it worked for Ayşe, and it worked for the women she saved, and it worked for the women they saved. One voice becomes 2, becomes 10, becomes 100, becomes a movement, becomes change. It takes time, it takes courage, it takes women who refuse to accept that their only value is in being chosen by men who will never see them. But it happens. The golden cage is empty now. The harem is gone. The traditions that sustained it for centuries have been relegated to history books and museum displays. But the lessons remain. The warning remains. The understanding that beautiful prisons are still prisons. That luxury doesn't erase captivity. That being given everything, except freedom, is the same as being given nothing. Ayşe's life proved that. Her escape proved that. Her survival proved that. She was one girl from one village, enslaved and erased and nearly destroyed. But she lived. She mattered. She made a difference. And that is how systems fall. Not all at once, not through grand gestures, but through individual acts of courage, individual demands for dignity, individual refusals to accept that this is just how things are. Ayşe refused to accept it. She spoke up. She escaped. She built something real. And because she did, other women could too. That was her legacy. Not wealth or fame or power. Just the simple revolutionary truth that freedom is worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible, even when no one believes you can win. She fought, she won, she lived. And somewhere in the hills near the Black Sea, in a village so small it never had a name, there might still be people who remember the story of a girl who was taken, and a woman who came back, who tell their daughters that survival is possible, that escape is possible, that you are worth more than what others try to make you. The golden cage is gone, but the need for that message remains. Because there are always cages, always systems that try to contain women, always voices that say, this is how things are, and this is how they must be. And there must always be women who say no, who demand more, who choose themselves, who live free. That was Ayşe's gift. That was what she proved was possible. And her story, passed down through generations, whispered in bakeries and marketplaces, and homes where women gather, remains a reminder. The cage is never as strong as it seems. The locks can be opened, the bars can be broken. All it takes is one voice, one demand, one woman who refuses to wait for someone else to grant her worth. All it takes is the courage to speak truth to power, and the stubborn refusal to give up hope, even when hope seems impossible. Ayşe had that courage. She lived that truth. And because she did, the golden cage that had held so many women for so many centuries eventually, finally, fell.